things that you're going to be able to kind of address and kind of improve yourself. So it's a great personal transformation tool. So with that said, I'm going to jump into Hijacking Bitcoin Part 2. And to reiterate, the point on this is I don't want to dig up, it's not about digging up old wounds or fighting with other Bitcoin maxis, because the fact is Bitcoin maxis that went through this period that are still Bitcoin maxis are, we can't deal with them. They're not open to discussion. In fact, they're explicitly not. They've blocked me. They've blocked Roger. They actually don't engage in conversation. They haven't engaged with this book. They haven't. No one has refuted the claims. They've adopted a strategy of ignoring it. And so these are people that have actually sold out their philosophy, sold out their ideology, and deep down they know that they've done that, but they haven't fully admitted it to themselves, let alone to anyone else. And so that's not who to convince. And that's a very small number of people. I mean, we're talking about probably like a dozen people, to be honest. Like, this is not a massive group. The group that really needs to hear this information are people who are new to Bitcoin and have no idea about the history. So yesterday I talked about the fact that, you know, Bitcoin was used as a currency, and early on big retailers like Overstock and Newegg used to take it. Subway sandwich franchises used to take it. It used to be actually used as a currency. You talk to people that just got into Bitcoin because of the 2017 bull rush or the 2021 bull rush, because that's when people come into Bitcoin. When the price goes up, that's when new people get attracted to it. They know nothing about the history. They know nothing about how it was designed. They've never read Satoshi's white paper, which outlines how the system works. I mean, we're talking about people that are now like, they're in Plato's cave. They're at the bottom of Plato's cave. They're like seeing reflections of reflections of reflections of what's going on. And so for those people, the information that I'm going through and trying to describe and summarize from the book is going to be eye-opening, because they've never been presented to it. And in all of my talks all over the country, you know, my wife and I have gone 26 states now, and I don't know, whatever, now multiple countries and going to Europe and everything else. And we're talking to people that are outside of the Liberty and crypto ecosystem, echo chamber, and they've never heard of this. They've never heard of any of these ideas. They've never heard of, actually most of them haven't heard of Roger. And certainly none of them have heard of this book. And when I do these workshops about CBDCs and alternatives, you know, there have been certain events where the Hijacking Bitcoin, I had more people coming up to me after the event asking me questions about Hijacking Bitcoin than about CBDCs. So that's how unfamiliar people are with this material. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. Section 2 of the book really goes into how Bitcoin was hijacked and some of the specific back and forth. I'm just going to go real surface level. And the whole point here is that, you know, if I were to summarize very quickly what happened, it's this: between 2014 and 2017, developers hijacked Bitcoin, ditching the original idea, which was cheap, fast cash for slow, pricey digital gold. That is the punchline of what happened. Hold on, let me see something. I'm noticing, I don't know why this block is here. Okay, hold on. Now we're better. Okay, so the next part of it. So how did they accomplish this? How was Bitcoin hijacked? And a big part of it was the use of propaganda and censorship. So for Bitcoin, a lot of the primary source for information for people early into Bitcoin was Reddit. And there was a thread called r/Reddit, when there still is. And the moderators would ban anyone who dissented from what the developers were trying to do in terms of keeping the blocks small and making Bitcoin something that is slow and pricey digital gold. Like, you would instantly be cut out. In fact, I talked to some people. I think Sal said he was a moderator and he got booted. And so this was a major issue, which was that if you're talking about making a proposal change or making changes to Bitcoin or whatever, and you're trying to get support from the community, well, if the primary channel where people get information about it was censoring people and banning people, then it really wasn't kind of a real open, you know, decision based on facts, based on information. It was something that was completely and totally manipulated by insiders. So this was one thing that's happened. And again, I experienced it personally. All I did was write a tweet recommending hijacking Bitcoin, and Roger retweeted it. And on the basis of Roger retweeting it, like half of the core Bitcoin core developers blocked me. I've been blocked by Michael Saylor. I've been blocked by Max Kaiser. I have been blocked by Adam Back. I've been blocked by Samson. Now, all of these people, in fact, I'll put together a collage of all of the people that have blocked me. And it's and most of those blocks, not all of them, were simply for recommending that people read Roger's book. So when Roger talks about censorship, and as the book outlines numerous examples of it, it's still ongoing. I would argue Roger being in Spain, not able to talk for fear of his words being used against him in court, I would argue his entire situation, legal situation, is part of the same chilling effect, part of the same censorship and propaganda, except now it's not just censorship and propaganda from people in the free market. Now it's actually state actors involved threatening to throw him in a cage for the rest of his life. So this censorship and propaganda is real, which is ironic, given that one of the features of Bitcoin is it's supposed to be, if you read the white paper, money that is censorship resistant and separate from centralized authority and centralized control. So censorship resistance is one of the key attributes of it, and yet the community itself has heavily used censorship to change and morph for the worse the offering itself, Bitcoin itself. And it even got worse. I'll show in a slide, a lot of people aren't aware of, there have been many different forks of Bitcoin and many different iterations of Bitcoin. And but early on, there were some attempts to increase the block size right off the bat. In fact, there was something called Bitcoin XT. And part of that process involved not only censorship and propaganda, but it involved actual physical attacks, DDoS attacks, on people that didn't support the narrative, to try to basically move the vote and push people that way. The other thing that you find in the book, one of the most fascinating aspects of the hijacking of Bitcoin, is that there was a self-proclaimed intelligence officer, government intelligence officer named John Dillon, we don't know if that's his real name, who actually paid to put out videos early on pushing for small blocks. He didn't like the idea. So we had somebody self-proclaimed from the US intelligence agencies who didn't like the idea of Bitcoin being used as cash, who early on was putting out videos discouraging this and trying to actually change the narrative in, like, I don't know, 2010, 2011. And then later on, he ended up funding a Bitcoin core developer to cement some of the changes to keep Bitcoin as a slow and expensive store of value instead of something that could be used as digital cash. And this story gets even weirder when we, which I won't talk about today, but Bitcoin, there's an active campaign of propaganda around the idea. They're already starting to warm people up to the idea that they're going to have to increase the 21 million supply. So one of the biggest features that Michael Saylor and other people talk about is that it's the hardest money on earth because there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. Well, that's likely not true. They're going to have to increase the supply, and in fact, it's not that difficult. Technically, it's kind of a trivial thing to increase the supply. It's a couple lines of code, but they're going to have to, and they're already starting to prep people for that. You're reading in BlackRock and Fidelity and risk factors for these ETFs. They're talking about it. And Peter Todd, who I mentioned, who was funded by this person with ties to the intelligence agencies, he was in an HBO documentary recently, and the HBO documentary tried to make him out to be Satoshi Nakamoto. And part of the propaganda in this film was claiming that Peter Todd, that there was no John Dillon, that Peter Todd was always Satoshi, and that he was essentially emailing himself. So they're trying to create this clever situation where Peter Todd ends up being Satoshi, and therefore the small blocks was always the original idea, and this whole story and all of the documents and evidence and communications back and forth with this self-proclaimed person from the intelligence agency was just made up by the guy who's in fact Satoshi. Well, Peter Todd is actually advocating for increasing the 21 million supply. In fact, he's been doing it for a couple of years. It was just a few weeks ago that he was advocating for it again. So in short, if they're using HBO documentaries and they're making this big push to claim that Peter Todd is Satoshi, then what that does is it kind of softens and makes it an easier sell to the entire Bitcoin community that, oh, hey, the guy who created Bitcoin, expected and believes that there should be an increase in the supply. And so now all of a sudden, it's more likely that that's going to pass. The next part of the hijacking involves a group called Blockstream. So essentially what happened is you had a group of early Bitcoin Core developers who stopped being Bitcoin Core developers and formed a for-profit corporation. And that for-profit corporation called Blockstream makes its money and profits by creating what are called layer 2 solutions on top of Bitcoin. So in other words, they make money, their ability to make money is based on keeping the base layer of Bitcoin slow and expensive. So in other words, keeping those blocks small. The lead investor for Blockstream was a guy who was the CEO of AXA, a European financial services company, and he was also the chairman, I believe, or president of the Bilderberg Group. Other investors in Blockstream include MasterCard and DCG and a whole bunch of other, one of the early investors in Tether. There's a whole bunch of overlap between Blockstream and Tether. So as you're going through and looking at this, what you're seeing is you have intelligence agency people influencing the development. Then you have developers going and forming a company that monetizes and benefits from keeping Bitcoin slow and expensive. There's more on the hijacking, and I'm not going to talk about it because it's not in Hijacking Bitcoin, but Roger's book goes up until really 2017. But so much more has happened. I mean, this thing has been hijacked multiple times, and it gets worse every time. Worse people get involved, and but yet the new people that get involved have a big megaphone, and so they use their propaganda and censorship so that people never get to find out the stuff that Roger was talking about as a front row participant in this from the very beginning. Also, the Bitcoin miners were betrayed at this process as well, because if you're a Bitcoin miner and you're investing all of this money in computer hardware, the expectation was that you were doing this on the basis of the assumption that Bitcoin was going to be doing Visa and MasterCard level transactions. And then ultimately you were going to make your money not just securing the network for speculative rewards, but by actually processing and getting transaction fees for every block that is produced every 10 minutes. And so the developers ignored the miners and in a very significant way throughout the entire process as this block war size war was going on to push their agenda of small blocks over big blocks. And I talked about this in detail yesterday, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore, which is that Lightning Network was what was offered as the solution. So they basically said, well, yeah, we're going to keep the blocks small, but that doesn't mean Bitcoin won't end up being a medium of exchange. People will start using it for payments again when we successfully implement this experiment called Lightning Network. Well, that was like 9 years ago. It doesn't work. Everybody admits it doesn't work, which is why last night I didn't go into more of the, normally I'd go into detail trying to show why and explain why it won't work, but we don't need to anymore because a lot of this Bitcoin maxi crew has given up on the idea of Bitcoin being used for payments and are focused solely on the store of value digital gold thing. With one exception, just today, Jack Dorsey, basically, actually yesterday he came out and said, Bitcoin's basically useless. If it's just a store of value, it needs to also be something that can be used for payments. And then today he came out with another tweet saying, there are other alternatives other than Lightning Network. So my guess is we can expect that he's working on something kind of behind the scenes, which based on his track record, I doubt that's a great thing for privacy, but it is what it is. So I'm going to go through the fork war history, but not in a lot of great detail, but just so that you know what has gone on behind the scenes. And this whole argument over keeping to the original vision of Bitcoin as a payment system as opposed to the store value has a long storied history with a lot of different players in it. There was something called Bitcoin XT, which was proposed in August of 2015. It ultimately was abandoned, but as part of the process of trying to get approval for that and consensus from the community, there were DDoS attacks, there was censorship on Reddit, and community pushback. There was something called Bitcoin Classic. Again, these all went through similar processes. Something called Bitcoin Unlimited. Most people have never heard of these things. I guess Bitcoin Unlimited exists. It just didn't get any traction. Bitcoin Cash was able to successfully fork off, but of course, then was the subject of all of this ridicule and ongoing propaganda and censorship. But Bitcoin Cash still exists today, and Bitcoin Cash maintains the original vision. It has larger blocks, in fact, blocks that can change in size dynamically. It can be used for cash. When I stopped using a bank account in 2019, Bitcoin Cash was the primary crypto that I used because it was available with more merchants and debit cards and everything else. You have Bitcoin Gold, Bitcoin SV. That could be I've done a whole podcast on BSV, so I'm not going to go through that here. And then something called eCash, which actually forked from Bitcoin Cash. So there are a lot of different things that have gone on here, and there's this whole saga and everything back and forth. But all of this stemmed from the fact that a group of developers hijacked the crypto. None of these forks would have existed if the original vision, as outlined in the white paper, had been just simply followed and continued.